Even though it lasted just one day, the Battle of Actium was a clash that would forever change the course of Roman history. In this epic encounter, the fate of emperors and kingdoms was at stake, with Octavian facing off against Mark Antony and the enigmatic Cleopatra in a struggle not just for power, but for the survival of their ambitions. The tension was palpable as the forces prepared for a duel that would seal the future of the empire. In this video, we'll dive into the events that led to this final decision, analyzing the strategies, key figures, and consequences of this crucial battle that marked the beginning of Rome's imperial era. By the end of the 1st century BC, Rome was in a period of transition, a time when the power of the Republic was on the verge of collapse. The assassination of Julius Caesar in 44 BC plunged the Roman world into a spiral of chaos and uncertainty, leaving a power vacuum. The Senate was weakened and political factions began clashing. The forces that once held the Republic together were now divided, and the civil war that followed represented the conflict between the Republic's past and the empire's future. Two men emerged as the key players in this war: Octavian, Julius Caesar's great-nephew and adopted son, and Mark Antony, an experienced general and one of Caesar's closest allies. The conflict between them wasn't just a military struggle, but also an ideological one. Octavian represented order and the continuity of Caesar's legacy, while Mark Antony, supported by Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt, aimed to establish a new form of power that united East and West under a dynastic rule. With the collapse of the Second Triumvirate, a fragile alliance between Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus, the clash became inevitable. The West, under Octavian's control, was dominated by a well-structured war machine and a diplomatic approach that sought to eliminate the last remnants of the Republic. Meanwhile, Mark Antony ruled the East alongside Cleopatra, consolidating forces and preparing his naval fleet, believing that naval dominance would be the deciding factor in this war. Tensions escalated as the two leaders moved strategically. Rome, once the center of absolute power, was divided between those who supported Octavian and those who believed in Mark Antony's promises. Roman citizens watched in astonishment as the empire fractured into factions, and the fate of Rome seemed uncertain. The Mediterranean world braced itself for a clash that would not only decide who would rule Rome, but also which vision of empire would prevail. The seeds of battle were sown. The fate of the Republic would be decided on the battlefield, and everyone knew that the approaching war would be the defining moment for the fall of the old order. The Roman world, of mighty legions and senators who no longer wielded the same power, awaited the confrontation that would shape the future of the West. Octavian, the young heir of Julius Caesar, was not a born warrior like many of his rivals. However, what he lacked in military experience, he made up for with political cunning and relentless determination. At just 19 years old, he inherited Caesar's name and, along with it, the expectations of becoming the most powerful man in Rome. Octavian quickly realized that to survive in the chaotic world of Roman politics, he needed to forge strong alliances and eliminate his enemies without mercy. His rise was marked by a series of skilled political maneuvers. He allied himself with Mark Antony and Lepidus, forming the Second Triumvirate, which divided control of Rome among the three. Together, they launched a campaign to eliminate Caesar's assassins and consolidate their power. However, the alliance between Octavian and Mark Antony was always fragile. Rivalry between the two, especially after the deaths of their main enemies, began to grow, and it didn't take long for tensions to escalate into open conflict. Octavian understood the value of propaganda and knew how to manipulate public opinion in Rome. He positioned himself as the defender of Roman order and tradition, in contrast to Mark Antony, who was drifting further away from Rome and aligning himself with Cleopatra in Egypt. For many, Octavian was the last bastion of Roman purity, while Mark Antony increasingly seemed subservient to the interests of a foreign queen. This image was crucial for Octavian to gain support among Roman citizens and senators. One of his biggest victories, even before Actium, was defeating Lepidus, the third member of the Triumvirate, relegating him to a position of political irrelevance. With Lepidus out of the way, Octavian focused his attention on Mark Antony, and final war seemed inevitable. Every move Octavian made was calculated, from consolidating his military forces to launching smear campaigns against his rival. He knew that time was on his side, and that Mark Antony, isolated in the east, would eventually fall into his trap. As Mark Antony and Cleopatra prepared their powerful naval fleet, Octavian gathered an army of veterans and an organized navy under the command of his general Agrippa. He was ready for a decisive confrontation, a clash that was not just about control of Rome, but about defining who would be remembered as Caesar's true successor. Octavian had a clear vision: to transform Rome into an empire under his control, and nothing would distract him from that goal. Mark Antony, one of Rome's most notorious generals, found himself in a strategically and emotionally delicate position. After allying with Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt, their relationship transcended mere political pragmatism, becoming a blend of love, mutual interest, and ambition. Cleopatra, ruling the wealthiest kingdom in the Mediterranean, saw in Antony not just a military partner, but an opportunity to expand her power and ensure Egypt's survival as an independent force. Together, they formed one of the most iconic alliances of antiquity. However, this union also generated significant tensions in Rome. For senators and for Octavian, Mark Antony was abandoning his Roman roots in favor of an Eastern alliance, which was viewed with deep suspicion and disdain. Octavian's propaganda portrayed Antony as a traitor to Rome, someone seduced by the luxuries of the East and Cleopatra's influence. The couple was depicted as exotic and corrupt figures, fueling the narrative that Mark Antony was no longer a true Roman at heart. For Cleopatra, the alliance was a matter of political survival. Egypt, with its vast wealth, was one of the few remaining independent kingdoms in a world dominated by Rome. By aligning with Mark Antony, she aimed to secure a prominent position and possibly establish a dynasty that could rule both East and West. Her ambition was clear: to make her son, Caesarion, Caesar's heir, a direct threat to Octavian's power. Cleopatra was a shrewd woman, adept at playing the political game just as well as any Roman ruler. As Mark Antony commanded legions in the East and solidified his alliance with Cleopatra, he began to lose support back in Rome. The physical and political distance weakened his standing among the Romans, and his devotion to Cleopatra was interpreted as a weakness. Even some of his former allies started to doubt his loyalty to Rome, fearing he was more concerned with Egyptian interests than with his homeland. The relationship between Antony and Cleopatra, once seen as a powerful alliance, now appeared to be a liability that Octavian was ready to exploit. This duality, love and politics, power and betrayal, was the essence of the conflict that would culminate in the Battle of Actium. The couple was not only fighting for themselves, but for a vision of a different empire, one that united East and West under a new form of government. For Octavian, however, this was an intolerable threat to the legacy of Rome and to his own destiny as its ruler. The Battle of Actium was, above all, a naval battle. While many Roman conflicts were fought on land, the decisive clash between Octavian and Mark Antony took place at sea, off the western coast of Greece. The stage was set. Mark Antony and Cleopatra had an impressive fleet composed of massive warships designed to be floating fortresses, while Octavian, under the command of his skilled General Agrippa, relied on a smaller, more agile, and well-organized fleet. Choosing Actium as the battlefield was no accident. Octavian and Agrippa managed to corner Antony and Cleopatra's forces in a geographically disadvantageous position. Antony's troops were isolated and increasingly dependent on dwindling supplies. Meanwhile, Octavian's fleet controlled the sea, preventing his enemies from resupplying. The strategy of attrition worked in Octavian's favor as he patiently awaited the right moment to strike. Antony's army, made up of loyal legions and the imposing Egyptian fleet, was banking on a decisive victory at sea. Cleopatra brought along the Egyptian navy, one of the most powerful in the Mediterranean, and they both believed their large, heavily fortified ships would prevail in direct combat. However, this confidence would turn out to be their biggest mistake. While their ships were indeed formidable, They were slow and less maneuverable, especially in the narrow waters of Actium. Agrippa, on the other hand, employed clever naval tactics, leveraging the mobility of his smaller, better-trained ships. He ordered his vessels to encircle the flanks of Antony's fleet, cutting off supply lines and disorganizing the enemy formation. Additionally, the use of catapults and other naval weaponry was crucial in neutralizing Cleopatra's large ships, which, despite their strength, lacked the agility to respond to Agrippa's coordinated attack. The battle, although initially balanced, soon began to tip in Octavian's favor. Agrippa's naval strategies, combined with the precarious position of Antony's forces, proved devastating. Amid the chaos of combat, Cleopatra made the fateful decision to retreat her fleet, abandoning the battle and leaving Mark Antony isolated. This moment would seal the fate of the confrontation and mark the beginning of the end for Antony and his queen. The morning of September 2nd, 31 BC, dawned with a palpable tension. In the waters of Actium, the two fleets were finally preparing for battle. On one side was the powerful and robust fleet of Mark Antony and Cleopatra, gathering the most imposing naval forces of the time. On the other, the agile and strategically superior strength of Octavian, under the command of Agrippa. As the winds shifted, the calm waters would soon transform into a battlefield that would determine the fate of the Roman Empire. Mark Antony knew this was his last chance to turn the tide of the war. His forces were largely concentrated on massive ships, which, while powerful, lacked agility. He relied on his military experience and the loyalty of his men. Cleopatra, closely observing from one of her ships, strategically hoped that the brute force of her vessels would prevail, compensating for the disadvantages posed by Octavian and his more maneuverable fleet. When the two fleets finally collided, the battle quickly descended into chaos. Antony's large ships advanced, trying to use their weight advantage to crush Agrippa's smaller vessels. However, Octavian's strategy was in full effect. He and his generals focused their attacks on strategic points of Antony's fleet, breaking formations and isolating the massive ships, which soon became easy targets for Agrippa's long-range weaponry. The battle slowly began to tilt in Octavian's favor. Amid the tumult of battle, something unexpected happened. Cleopatra, who had been leading the charge with her Egyptian fleet, made a crucial decision. She ordered her ships to retreat, possibly realizing that the battle was lost or fearing for her own safety. Her sudden withdrawal left Mark Antony disoriented and his forces even more vulnerable. Cleopatra's exit symbolized not only the rupture of a military alliance, but also the emotional and psychological collapse of Mark Antony, who was now alone in an impossible fight. Mark Antony's fate was sealed when his fleet began to disintegrate under Octavian's relentless assault. Although many of his soldiers fought to the end, Cleopatra's retreat and the siege organized by Agrippa made any resistance futile. The battlefield, once a stage for grand hopes, was now a graveyard of sunken ships and shattered dreams. Realizing the inevitable, Mark Antony withdrew, leaving behind what remained of his forces.